In March of 1933, Europe and the rest of the world would be forever changed when Adolf Hitler became the Reichschancellor of Germany. And Hitler and the Nazis had a plan, and they knew what they were doing, because within just a few weeks of Hitler taking power, construction began on a concentration camp at the site where I am today at Dachau. I wanted to start our visit here at Dachau with one of the more enduring symbols of the Holocaust: railroad tracks. One of the more haunting images that we see come out of the Holocaust are our prisoners being hauled in freight cars all across Nazi-occupied Europe. What we are looking at here is one of the few remaining examples of the branch line that connected the main railway station to the camp at Dachau. The rest of it now is kind of like a pedestrian path that follows the original course. But when prisoners would come to Dachau, well, they would come to the main railway station, and then they would either have to walk to the camp. There was also like vehicular transport or prisoner transport that would take them to the entrance gate. And then there was also this rail line. Before we move on to the camp, I do want to mention something else in connection with these rail lines. In late April of 1945, the 45th Infantry Division would have moved into this area. The 42nd Infantry Division, also the 20th Armored, came into the area of Dachau, and one of the first things that they encountered were these rail cars, or these freight cars, that were filled with dead bodies. Well, towards the end of the war, a lot of the camps were being liquidated or emptied out, and prisoners were being relocated here to Dachau, and there was something called a death train from Buchenwald that came right here to this general area. And there's a lot of video footage and photos that you'll see of these just awful mounds of corpses stacked up inside these rail cars. And then with the 45th Infantry Division, there were some reprisal killings that took place in response to what they found when they moved into this area. Nobody was ever convicted, and there's been debate ever since over whether it was justified or not. But yeah, there were some awful things that took place here at Dachau. All right, we're going to go ahead and move on to the main camp now. One thing that people may not realize about Dachau is that this place is more than just the concentration camp. There was a vast compound that housed the SS here in Dachau. As a matter of fact, this was one of the main training facilities for the SS. So a lot of the camp guards who would go on to other places in the Reich would be trained right here. So you can kind of think of Dachau as the model that all of the other camps would be based off of. So if we look here, well, here's the main gate going into the camp. Here, the red dot is where we are standing. This right here is all of the SS buildings. So if we look out in this direction, well, behind us is the camp, and in front of us is the SS facilities. As a matter of fact, that building there on the right is where the commandant's headquarters would have been. And then right here you can see the camp itself, which we were getting ready to go through, and then again, all of these different facilities. So there would have been a porcelain factory there. There would have been a clothing factory where inmates here at the concentration camp would be making clothing for the SS. And they would enter right along this road and go through that gate. From the rail station, people who had been condemned to come to Dachau would either walk or be transported by truck or rail to this spot right here. And it is through these gates that they would enter into this awful place. This is called the House. This is the gatehouse and office building of the SS. It was built in 1936. And as people well know, as you entered through that gate, you'd see the words Arbeit macht frei, which means work makes you free, or work brings freedom. There would be guards here 24 hours a day. There would be a sentry posted on the ground floor that would control access into and out of the camp. They would also have an alarm system that was operated from here. And the camp fence, which surrounded the perimeter of the camp and was electrified, was powered from here as well. There would also be interrogation rooms inside of this building where the Gestapo would operate. So, yeah, kind of a dark place here. As we approach the gate to go into the camp here, well, on either side, they have a few memorials to the divisions who helped to liberate this camp. So this one is to the 20th Armored Division, as in honor of the 20th Armored Division Liberators, U.S. 7th Army, who participated in the liberation of Dachau concentration camp, April 29th, 1945, and an everlasting memory of the victims of Nazi barbarism. This tablet was dedicated April 28th, 1996. And then there's another one over here, very similar to the 42nd Infantry Division, nicknamed the Rainbow Division. Now, the 45th Infantry Division also participated in the liberation of Dachau, but to my knowledge, they don't have a plaque here. And then, yeah, those who entered this camp would have entered through this gate. As you walk through the gates here at Dachau, the first thing that you will come upon is the Appelplatz, or the roll call ground. So every morning and every evening, regardless of the weather conditions, whether it was snowing or raining or whether it was hot sun, there would be a head count. So they would get into rows of 10 all along here. Even the dead would have to be dragged out to be counted. And the guards could do really whatever they wanted here. They could make them stand for a few minutes, or they could make them stand for 3 hours. So you can just imagine the scene here as we were looking across this open ground, what that must have been like. Throughout Dachau's existence as a concentration camp, there would be over 200,000 people who would pass through these gates. When we are looking at Dachau, this is, of course, a concentration camp, but not the type of concentration camp that you may be familiar with. This is not like an Auschwitz. This isn't a death camp. This was a concentration camp that was set up for political prisoners after Hitler took power in 1933. So up until 1941-42, most of the prisoners that you would have seen assembling here in the Appelplatz where we are standing would have been Poles or Czech or other German prisoners. And the building that we are looking at right now is the maintenance building. So once prisoners entered through those gates right there, well, the maintenance building would be the first place that they would go to. This was built in 1937 to 38 by the prisoners, so it wasn't here originally. And there would be a kitchen in there, a clothing supply room, baths, and workshops. There was also over here in the West Wing something called a shunting room, where the registration process began for newly arrived prisoners. And on the roof, in large letters, was painted the sentence, "There is a path to freedom. Its milestones are obedience, honesty, cleanliness, sobriety, hard work, discipline, sacrifice, truthfulness, and love of thy fatherland." All right. Now, the maintenance building has been converted into a museum. So we're going to go in and take a moment to see what they have inside. When you come into this building that has been converted into a museum complex, the first thing that you see is this vast network of concentration camps. So most people are, familiar with, Auschwitz and Dachau and Buchenwald, but there were camps of various kinds all over Germany and in the occupied areas. Pretty sobering whenever you see it all laid out on a map like this. This room that we are entering into now is the prisoner transport room. And they have, of course, a bunch of displays here for the museum portion, but a lot of what you see, like the finish on the walls and everything, is original. So it looks very much like it would have during the 30s and 40s. But this is where prisoners would come in and hand over their belongings and their clothing and things like that. And, here they're standing without all of their belongings, and then they look up at this, which translates to smoking prohibited. So this would have been one of the first rooms that the prisoners would have entered into once arriving at Dachau. In this room they have some displays that show artifacts from some of the people who were held here at Dachau, including this man whose name was Hermann Boehmer. He was born in 1923. And prior to coming to Dachau, he was in a camp that was called a, quote, gypsy camp in the Berlin area, and was put into police custody and then sent to Sachsenhausen concentration camp, and then was eventually transferred here to Dachau. Here's another story of a guy named Joseph Unsen. Joseph Unsen was in the German army and served at the front, and then was deployed as a guard to collection camp number 6 of the armaments detail. And that would have been in the Munich area. Well, in November of 44, he helped a friend of his to try and avoid military service by injuring himself with a bandage soaked in acid. And when the doctors found out what happened, well, Joseph was not going to find himself in the military anymore. He would be sent to the Dachau concentration camp. That would have been January of 1945, and he ended up dying here 3 months later. After the admissions procedure in the room that we were just in, prisoners would have come into this room. This was the steam distribution room. You can see a picture, lighten that up a little bit, of what this would have looked like. whenever the concentration camp was in operation. This next room is where the prisoner baths were located. So after going through the processes that we just mentioned, this would be the last step of admission. So here prisoners would get a shower, they would be deloused, and then they would get their uniform that they would wear here at the camp. Also, if you look at these beams up here, I also read that this is the room where the SS would carry out what they called pole hangings. Now, prisoners would get a shower about once a week early on, but as things progressed and as the war drug on, that became less and less, and things became even more unsanitary here. Corporal punishment was something that was a routine thing here at Dachau, and here in this same room, in the shower room, they also carried out some of that corporal punishment, although it was done in other parts of the camp as well. So prisoners would be made to lean over this wooden trestle, where they would then be beat with bullwhips or sticks or anything else to inflict cruelty on these prisoners. And I had also heard that if they passed out in the process, well, when they woke back up, they would be forced to start from the beginning and go through the whole thing again. Just absolute cruelty. As I've already mentioned, it's going to be impossible for me to show everything here, but I do want to pick out a few things here and there to point out. This is something that I found exceptionally interesting. This is the wedding photo of a guy by the name of Johann Prestel. So this was taken in 1930, and Prestel ended up becoming a political prisoner here at Dachau. Now take a look at this. He was a stove fitter, and what we are looking at here is an oven tile from an oven that was built by Johann Prestel. And there were 3 German inmates that kind of documented their stay here or what they did on this tile. Now, the text of the inscription says, "Oven built by Johann Prestel." The text of the inscription here says, "Oven built by political Dachau prisoner Johann Prestel, the stove fitter." And then it goes on to give some biographical information, when he was here. And then it says, "How much longer, the devil only knows." And then it's signed by the prisoners that were assisting him. And they hid this tile in an oven, and it wasn't discovered until 1980 during demolition work. When we entered the campgrounds, we walked through a gate that said Arbeit macht frei, which means work will set you free. And that gate is actually a replica. What we are looking at here is the original gate that was built by the camp prisoners in 1936. Now, in 2014, there were some people that forcibly entered the grounds of the memorial site and stole this gate, which is an unbelievable dirtbag move. I can't even imagine somebody doing that kind of a thing, but they did. And of course, the replica went up where the historical camp gate was located. But then in 2016, an anonymous tip led police to a Norwegian city in Bergen that led to the recovery of the stolen gate. That was in February of 2017 that it was returned here. But yeah, this is the original gate. We've just exited out of the maintenance building, and here on the site they don't have any of the original barracks, but they do have some reconstructed barracks that we're going to take a look at here in just a moment. But first I want to show the perimeter defenses that were designed to keep people inside of the gates of Dachau. Again, from 1937 to 1938, a new camp was built here in Dachau, and the perimeter fence that they built here made escape nearly impossible. So for one, there were 7 guard towers along the perimeter of the camp, and they kept constant watch over this area. Now, let's say for the sake of argument, you were a prisoner inside this camp and you wanted to try and escape. Well, first you would have to enter across this, what is now a green lawn. This was the prohibited zone. If you entered into this area, you were subject to being shot. If you manage to get past the prohibited zone, well, then there was this ditch that completely went along the outside of the camp. If you made it through the ditch, well, then there are tangles of barbed wire. Beyond the barbed wire, you have to deal with electric fencing. And then there is another perimeter that is constantly being patrolled by guards, and then finally this concrete fence, which again has barbed wire at the top. So once you were in here, getting out was nearly impossible. Obviously, it goes without saying that the suffering here in Dachau is something that most of us just can't comprehend. And for some people in here, the suffering just proved to be too much. And one of the ways that prisoners would just put an end to that suffering was to run towards these perimeter fences, where they would either be shot or they would throw themselves up against the electric fence and kill themselves in that manner. Just awful to think of people being in that desperate and terrible of a situation where they would be put in a position to do that. All right, we're going to go take a look at the reconstructed barracks now. Here inside the residential barracks, you can see what these bunks and what this area would have looked like, except for this is rather clean. It wouldn't have been nearly as clean during the time that Dachau was in operation. And these residential barracks were designed to hold 200 people. In reality, they ended up holding about 2,000. So it would be very easy for us to look at one of these sections and think, oh, okay, there's one bed section for one person. But in reality, you would have had multiple people stacked up in here together, laying on beds of straw. Of course, people sick from typhus and all kinds of other ailments. Typhus is actually spread by lice. The way that lice got into the camp was they were running out of clothing here. So they imported some clothing that was, I guess, taken from people in Auschwitz. And lice ended up getting into the population here and then spreading typhus. But yeah, this would have been a miserable, miserable place. What we are looking at right here in this reconstructed barracks is the washroom. Now, of a morning before roll call, everybody in this entire barrack would be required to wash up, but would only have a few minutes. So you can imagine several hundred people trying to crowd in here and make use of the washroom and also of the toilet facilities in here. So there was a certain cruelty that was exacted on these people by the SS, where they watched them scramble to try and use these facilities and get out to roll call on time. While we are here talking about the barracks, I want to mention blocks 1, 3, and 5, which is just beyond block 3 here. There were unimaginably cruel medical experiments that were conducted on the prisoners here at Dachau. And those medical experiments took place in these 3 blocks. So some of the human experimentation that was done here were medical experiments with malaria, also testing to see the effects of altitude on the human body. They had pressure chambers that they would put people in. They were also testing the limits. They were testing the limits of hypothermia on the human body, just subjecting these poor people to a level of cruelty that seems incomprehensible to us today. The infirmary here at Dachau was actually well equipped, but the medical care, goes without saying, was completely awful. And there was a lot of sickness here in these barracks. Typhus, just absolutely awful. So prisoners who became ill, well, if they could not be brought back to health quickly, well, they would go to the infirmary, where they would die shortly after. So I just learned something new about Dachau, or at least new to me. This is something that I had never heard before. If you look at this building, well, that building would have stood right here. Now, originally there was a garden here in the camp, and then they had animals here. They would use the wool for Luftwaffe uniforms, and in 1941 a disinfection facility for the prisoners' clothing was built here. But in the spring of 1944, the SS set up a so-called special barrack. And this is just suffering on top of suffering. This was a bordello where female prisoners from Ravensbrück were forced into prostitution. I've made my way to the other end of the camp, and here on this end of Dachau, they have some faith-based memorials. So over here to our left, this is a chapel for the Christians. In the center is the Catholic memorial, and to our right is the Jewish memorial. Right now, the Jewish memorial appears to be undergoing some renovation or some improvements. So unfortunately, I can't go down there and show what I would like to show. But I do think that what they have done here is worth mentioning and worth talking about. If you look at how they have built this, as you go down to the memorial, you are descending down this dark path. And when you enter into the memorial, you are entering into this cavernous darkness. But in the middle of that darkness, there's a white band of marble that goes all the way to an opening in the ceiling where you can see that menorah at the top that allows a beam of light to shine down, symbolizing that even in the darkest place, a place like Dachau, there's still hope and there's still light. So for many here at Dachau, whether they were Christian or Catholic or Jewish, it was their faith that brought them through this dark time and this unimaginable suffering. So again, this is the Catholic monument here at Dachau, and the name of it is the Catholic Mortal Agony of Christ Chapel. This was dedicated in 1960 at the initiative of a bishop named Johann Neuhausler. He was a prisoner here at Dachau. Okay, so this is a man who experienced the suffering and experienced the darkness of this place. And the reason that the name Mortal Agony of Christ was chosen was as an allusion to the mortal agony under which tens of thousands of inmates suffered day and night for years here in the camp. And then you see the crown of thorns at the top. So basically likening the mortal agony of Christ with the agony of the people who suffered here, and showing that Christ is not detached or distant or unfamiliar with our suffering. Here is a closer look at the Protestant memorial here at Dachau. The official name is the Protestant Church of Reconciliation, and you can see the lines and the edges of this church are a little bit different. They're kind of asymmetrical, and that is to contrast with the symmetrical design of this camp. And I think it's interesting that they chose the name Church of Reconciliation. I would imagine that the people who survived this experience had seen enough death and hatred, and were ready for something different when they left. And to hate is honestly pretty easy for us to do, but to forgive and to reconcile is vastly more powerful, and this church reflects that. As I've mentioned a few times already, Dachau was not a death camp. This was a work camp, but that doesn't mean that there wasn't a lot of death within these walls. As a matter of fact, about 20% of the people who entered through the gates of Dachau would never leave. There was malnutrition, there was disease, prisoners were worked to death. And we're getting ready to leave the camp complex itself and go to the part of Dachau that I consider to be probably the most sobering spot in this place. In the summer of 1940, foreign prisoners started arriving here at Dachau, and with that, the number of deaths here really began to ramp up. So the SS found it necessary to build a crematorium just outside of the camp walls in order to dispose of the remains of all of the dead. So this crematorium was built in the summer of 1940 and would be in operation until April of 1943, when an even larger facility became necessary. But while this crematorium was in operation, there were approximately 11,000 prisoners who were cremated in this very oven. When the original crematorium proved to be insufficient to accommodate the number of dead here at Dachau, well, this facility was built. This was built between 1942 and 1943, and here on the left-hand side was a disinfectant center. Here in the middle is where we would find the gas chamber. So this was going to be used as a killing center, although it never was put into full effect. There was some killings that took place in here, but mass killings on a large scale did not happen at this gas chamber. It's not to say that it didn't happen at others, but it just didn't happen here. And then over here on the right-hand side, this is where the larger crematorium was going to be built. I'm standing on the left-hand side of the building that I was just showing, where the disinfectant of clothing would take place. So clothing would be brought into these chambers right here. You would have Zyklon B that would be added to the chamber to kill any lice or any bugs or mites that might be in the clothing. And then there was a ventilator that would pump the air out before they came in here and got the clothing. And I heard one account of clothing coming in from Auschwitz because the clothing was not being used there anymore because that was a mass killing center. We're going to go ahead and enter into Barrack X here and just do a quick walkthrough. So this room that we are standing in right now is the waiting room. This is where victims would be informed that they were going to be entering into a shower. And then in this room is where they would be asked to disrobe. So you can see Brausbad right there. That means shower. And from there they would enter into the gas chamber. This room right here is the gas chamber. Now again, it was never used for its intended purpose, but we can get an idea of what would have happened in here if things would have continued, if the war hadn't have ended. So this could hold about 150 people, and they would be in here for about 15 to 20 minutes. The Zyklon B would be put into this room through these ports right here. And then again, they would wait about 15 to 20 minutes, and after all the people in here had suffocated, well, then they would pump the air out. There was a water supply that was provided in here where they could clean up, and then the bodies would be moved into this room right here. So this is called the death chamber, and this is where the bodies would be held until cremation. All right, and then moving into this room, this was the crematorium that was built in 1943 to basically accommodate for the growing number of dead here in the camp. Boy, just a sobering thought. When the men of the 45th and 42nd Infantry Divisions and 20th Armored Division arrived here at Dachau, you can just imagine being an 18, 19, 20-year-old guy and walking up on this scene. Right here in front of us, there would have been just piles and piles of bodies. And you might ask yourself, if there was a crematorium in operation, why were there so many bodies that were stacked up outside of this building? Well, the answer is, in February of 1945, there was a coal shortage in Germany, and they didn't have enough coal to operate the crematorium. So they ended up just stacking bodies here until they could be buried in a mass grave. But, yeah, awful. I've now moved just away from the gas chamber and crematorium. And as I mentioned, just because the gas chambers weren't put into full effect here at Dachau, doesn't mean that there weren't some awful things that took place here and executions that were carried out. Matter of fact, right here along this wall, prisoners were brought here and lined up and executed, and there's what they call a blood ditch along here that would allow for the drainage of blood. Just unbelievable, some of the awful things that people are capable of. But of all the places I've been, this one might have the heaviest and most somber feel to it. We have some other places here in this area that we're going to go take a look at that tie in with the history of Dachau, but that'll be in the next video.